So human beings start off in the state of nature, and given their primary motivations, given the fact that they have this right of nature, a right to everything, and the state of nature ends up being a state of war. It ends up being a state in which human beings' worst fear is realized, namely a fear of untimely death. Because life in the state of nature is short, nasty, brutish, and short. That's short twice, whatever. That's the one that we really actually care about. Life is short. Um, Human beings then are somewhat eager to leave the state of nature. Well, how do they do that? Well, as we've been discussing, they might stop and start thinking about, well, geez, what we need is peace. But that's not going to mean, okay, well, we need to lay down our rights to think, well, that's not going to, well, we need covenants, we need to perform them. But that doesn't work, well, at least not immediately, because covenants are invalid in a state of nature. So how on earth do we leave the state of nature? Hobbes's idea, very quickly, is that we form a commonwealth. And a commonwealth is just Hobbes's word for a political community. So we avoid this war, we avoid untimely death by forming a political community, a commonwealth. And so Hobbes's idea is that it's out of a desire for self-preservation, out of a fear of untimely death, be it from starvation or your spear or whatever, right? Individuals agree to form a political community, a commonwealth. One of the things we're going to be discussing in this video, so the main point of this video is to discuss how it is that this works, how it is that it happens, and what light this sheds on the political community, how we should think about the political community, the Commonwealth. But one of the things I'm also going to be mentioning in this video are contrasts with Aristotle, because there's really coming to the fore now, and we can already see one of the big contrasts with Aristotle, with what I've called the classical political tradition. According to Aristotle, what is the point or purpose of a political community? It's not merely living, it's not self-preservation. The point of a political community is not merely to live, but to live well. In Hobbes, you get no indication of that. According to Hobbes, no, the point of a political community, it's not all this virtue stuff. It's not any of that, life of the mind and everything else. The point of a political community is to avoid the state of war that is the state of nature. It's to ensure better self-preservation. Because without a political community, you're likely to starve or get stabbed in the back. That's why we have political communities. That's Hobbes's view. So it's a different view about what the point or purpose of political community is. Is the point of a political community just, is it merely to make sure people don't kill me and steal my stuff? That's kind of Hobbes's view. Or is it to help ensure that I can live a full, flourishing human life? That's Aristotle's view. All right. So what I want to do now is talk about how exactly this works. Because when we've been talking about the laws of nature, what I've been trying to point out to you is the way in which it's hard for people in the state of nature to follow the laws of nature. Given the conditions of a state of nature, you're just going to have this war, and you're going to have people being suspicious of other people, and nobody's going to trust other people. Yeah. And so that makes any kind of cessation to the state of war impossible, it seems. And so now Hobbes is going to say, well, look, a commonwealth, this is how we can make everything better. Well, okay, fine. How is that going to work? I mean, we still have this problem. We're in the state of nature. We have these fears. So how are we going to possibly form a commonwealth together? So let's take a group of people, right? So this is going to be I get maybe like the smallest kind of commonwealth you can have, where these three people are going to form a commonwealth. Well, how does that work? So right now they're in this state of nature. So I've given them names. because they're going to be talking to each other in just a second, right? So Pat, Chris, and Jack, they're all in a state of nature together, yeah? But they've all kind of been given their 15 minutes of thought or whatever, and they realize this is no good. This state of nature is pretty terrible. We're going to die. Whew, how can we possibly get out of this? Here's how. Or this is what Hobbes says, at least. These people, Pat, Chris, and Jack, these people who want to form a commonwealth, form a political community, they start making agreements with each other. So what happens is each member of the prospective commonwealth has to agree with each other member to lay down their right of nature. So Pat says to Chris, hey, I agree to lay down my right to your body and your resources, ... That ... is going to be important, right? This isn't the full agreement that they're making. There's something to be added. We'll see in a second. And then Pat says the same thing to Chris. And then Pat and Jack have to do it, right? They make the same kind of agreement. And then Chris and Jack have to do it, right? So they're all agreeing with each other to lay down their rights of nature, right? I'm not going to rearrange your body parts. You don't rearrange mine. And I'm not going to take the stuff that you've collected. You don't take the stuff that I've collected, right? That's essentially what's happening here, right? But look, we already saw that. Or something really similar to that when we were considering the laws of nature, when we were considering the second law of nature. And that didn't work because they would, fine, you'd have the people say something like that, but there was still this reasonable suspicion that somebody might kind of break the agreement, right? And maybe someone's just saying that so they can come and stab me in the back and take my stuff. Well, that's, and if they just ended it there, if there were no ... well, yeah. That's what would happen. We'd still be in the state of nature. But there's more to their covenant than just this. There's more to their agreement than just this. Because what Hobbes envisions happening is that there's like another step that they take. So in addition to each of them agreeing to lay down their rights of nature, they also make the following agreement with each other. Right? So some other fella kind of just happens to be around, walking around. They all, in addition to making those individual agreements with each other, they all give the power to enforce those agreements over to some guy, some random guy, whatever. It could be anybody. Or, as Hobbes will put it, some assembly of people. But what he really has in mind is like one guy who's going to become the king, right? That's the kind of idea here. We give that guy the power to enforce these covenants. That's what makes that guy the ruler. So there are two parts to the covenant. They first agree with each other, each individual with each other individual, to lay down their right of nature, right? I lay down my right to your things, you lay down your right to my things. And as part of that agreement, we designate some one person or some assembly of people to enforce these covenants. Oops. There it is. That's how you get a king. And Hobbes is like, well, why does this work? Well, because now the king will enforce those covenants. Part of what it is to authorize the king to designate this one person to enforce these covenants is that Pat, Chris, and Jack all agree to use their own individual power and strength in the king's service. Yeah. So let's say Pat breaks his covenant. Let's say Pat, so they do all this. Yeah. Pat, Chris, and Jack make this agreement, lay down the right of nature, and designate this one guy as the guy who can enforce the covenant. But now let's say Pat decides to steal Chris's apple. Well, what's the king going to do? What's that fellow with the mustache going to do? He's going to come use the strength of Chris, Jack, and himself, and whoever else is part of the Commonwealth, to come get Pat, to punish him, right? And Pat knows that. Everybody in the Commonwealth knows that, right? The king is authorized to use the strength and power of the community to enforce the covenant. Now, Pat, knowing that, probably won't steal the apple. It's not worth his grief. Yeah? Because if I steal it, chances are I'll probably get caught and then I'll get punished something severe. And I don't want that, right? There's a whole group of people. They're going to come after, they're going to be mad. And so I'm not, I'll just go find my own apple. That's fine. That's a commonwealth. There is now what Hobbes sometimes calls a common power to enforce the laws of nature and covenants, right? And so now the laws of nature have kind of purchase on us. Now we will seek peace and follow it because we don't want to get punished, because the king's going to come down on us like something fierce if we break that law of nature or if we break our covenants. Yeah, that's Hobbes's idea. And so this commonwealth is like a kind of a cleverly constructed artificial community. We make it up. We're trying to figure out this way out of this state of nature because it's so awful and terrible. And we come up with this idea. I know what we do. This is how we can do it. We make this community where we designate this one guy and blah, 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 blah. Right? Again, we have a pretty sharp point of disagreement, a pretty clear point of disagreement between Hobbes and Aristotle. And in particular, Aristotle's political naturalism. One of the central tenets of Aristotle's political naturalism is that the city-state is natural. It's like a spider's web or a bird's nest or whatever. Hobbes, right here, is totally denying that. There is nothing natural at all about political community. It's very unnatural. It actually doesn't fit that well. And we kind of have to take a second to think about how could we possibly do this. It is a product of artifice. It's artificial. It's made. It's like a computer or whatever. It's just something that we made to further our own ends. Not natural at all, according to Hobbes, right? Now, let's take a second to kind of encapsulate the things that I've just been discussing, right? So this covenant that we make that creates the commonwealth, there are two parts to it. First, we have to agree to lay down our right of nature, right? I agree not to take your resources that you've collected. You agree not to take mine. I agree not to rearrange your body parts if I deem it necessary. You agree not to do the same to me. Yeah? That's a laying down of our rights of nature. I transfer my right to do those things to you. You transfer them to me. Whatever. That's the kind of idea. That's the idea. And so, one important point to point out here, this is the origin, the true, real origin of what we would call property. Because when we think about property, there isn't really property in a state of nature. You don't really own anything. You know, I own this pen. Why do I own it? Because I have an exclusive right to it. I have a right to it, and you don't. Right? And if you come and take it, you're violating my right. You're not exercising any right that you have. You don't have a right to it. That's what makes it my property. Not merely that I have a right to it, but that I have an exclusive right to it. You don't get exclusive rights to things until everybody else lays down their rights to your collected resources, right? I don't have an exclusive right to the pen until everybody else has laid down their right to the pen. Well, when we join a political community, when we're part of a political community, everybody has laid down their rights to my stuff. And so it really, for the first time, becomes my stuff, right? So this is the origin of property. That's one part of the covenant we make with each other. And we also agree to authorize one person as governor or ruler. And this ruler is the Leviathan of the title of the work. You might call him the sovereign, the ruler, the king, that guy, right? We authorize that one person. We give all our power and strength to that one person. We tell them that they can do with it as they see fit. They now have a kind of the power to use our power, right? We authorize them. That is now a legitimate political authority. And it's a legitimate political authority precisely because all of the subjects authorize that person. Precisely because all of the subjects voluntarily transferred their rights both to each other and, more importantly, to the king, to the Leviathan. I transfer my right to govern myself to the Leviathan, to that guy. And so that guy's rule, the king's rule, is legitimate. It's authorized. And so to disobey him is illegitimate. I'd be breaking my covenant. It's unjust to disobey the political authority. Right? That's Hobbes's idea. I'd be breaking my covenant. And in particular, by disobeying the political authority, by disobeying the Leviathan, I'm being unjust not to the Leviathan, I'm being unjust to my fellow subjects, right? I'm breaking my covenant with them. I make the covenant with them to authorize this person as the Leviathan. And so I'm being unjust to you if I disobey, don't listen to the political authority. That's in addition to being right. Obviously, if I go steal your stuff, I'm breaking my covenant. I have, I've transferred my right to your stuff to you, and so I no longer have a right to it. And by going and taking your stuff, I'd be breaking that covenant, right? And so, of course, that's unjust. Murder, likewise, will now be unjust. Because again, I've transferred my right to rearrange your body parts to you. I can no longer do that. Yeah. I no longer have a right to do that. Whereas in a state of nature, I did. So killing somebody was not wrong, was not unjust in the state of nature. It is unjust now that we're in a political community. Right there he is, Leviathan. Perfect. One point I want to draw out now. Well, how does that one guy, the Leviathan, how does he stand vis-a-vis the subjects and covenants? Does the Leviathan enter into the covenant? You know, the way we were describing it earlier, it was you had the members who were going to form the political community, so Pat, Chris, and Jack, they all make this agreement with each other, and they kind of point over at this fella with the ears and mustache or whatever, saying, yeah, that guy, he's our ruler. Does the Leviathan agree? Does he have to? Does he, the Leviathan, enter into a covenant with the subjects? Hobbes is very clear. No, the Leviathan does not enter into a covenant with the people. And indeed, it would be impossible for the king to. The only reason that the covenant I make with you is valid is because there's a common power to enforce it, because we've designated the Leviathan, this one guy, we've authorized him to enforce this covenant. That makes it valid. There's now this common power that can hold us in fear and terror of breaking the covenant. And therefore, that covenant is valid because there's no longer a reasonable suspicion that people are going to break it. There's a reasonable suspicion that people will keep it because they don't want to get punished, right, by the Leviathan. The Leviathan himself, however, right, so what makes our covenants valid is that there's this common power to enforce them. If the Leviathan were to enter into if part of the picture was that the Leviathan has to enter into a covenant with the subjects, well, there would need to be a common power to enforce that covenant. We would need another Leviathan for that covenant. And if that Leviathan had to enter into a covenant with the Leviathan and all the people, well, we would need another Leviathan, right? There'd always need to be another common power to enforce it. If the Leviathan were to enter into a contract with the people. But Hobbes's view, right, to cut off that kind of infinite regress, is that the Leviathan does not enter into a covenant with the people. That has implications. What that means in the first place is that, and this is what Hobbes really emphasizes, the Leviathan cannot act unjustly toward his subjects. It is impossible. It's conceptually impossible for the Leviathan to do anything unjust to his subjects. Because what is injustice? It's simply the breaking of a covenant. And the Leviathan has not entered into a covenant with his subjects. And so it's impossible for the king to be unjust to his subjects, or if you had a parliament, for the parliament to be unjust to the citizens, to the subjects. And so now we can kind of see, kind of bringing it full circle, how Hobbes's ideas here relate to his particular context. He was a royalist. He lived during this English Civil War, and in that conflict, he was on the side of the king. He was on the side of those who were advocating for the king to win. And you can kind of start to see why now. He thought it's unjust that the people who were vying against the king were breaking their covenant. They'd already agreed to authorize the king, and now they were breaking that agreement. They were breaking that agreement with their other fellow citizens. That's unjust. They're in the wrong. That king was authorized. That king can do what he or she pleases, king or queen. The complaint that the king is acting unjustly, nonsensical. Kings can't act unjustly towards their subjects. Yeah. Moreover, the worry that Hobbes has over this civil war, over these people who are, over injustice more generally, people breaking covenants, is that you risk sending us back into a state of nature by breaking your covenant, by disobeying the king. There is nothing worse than being in a state of nature. Fine, you've got, a king who acts arbitrarily and capriciously and doesn't. That's better than being in this state of nature. Anything is better than that state of nature. And in fact, by locating authority in one figure, the king, we best ensure that we avoid that state of nature. And so Hobbes is actually a critic of dividing governmental authority, political authority. He thinks that shouldn't be done, right? So something like what you find in the United States, where we have these different branches of government and different authorities within those branches, different powers divided among those branches, you would think that's a bad idea. What happened in England with Parliament trying to acquire more authority for itself over and above the king. And so you had these bad idea. It's a bad idea to divide authority like this, because what does it do? It naturally leads to civil war. It naturally leads to one side trying to get more and more power than the other. It naturally leads to the dissolution of the political community, naturally leads to the dissolution of the Commonwealth. And that is just about the worst thing you could possibly do, because the risk you run in dissolving the Commonwealth is that you throw us back into a state of nature in which life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. I think I got it right that time. And so Hobbes comes down on the side of the royalists, not because he believes in the divine right of kings, but because of these ideas about authorization and legitimate political authority being authorized by the people through their agreement, through their consent. He doesn't use that word consent, but it gets picked up later in the tradition. And so though he is this advocate of kind of the absolute authority of a king, I trust that you can already see how the reasoning he gives for that absolute authority and why that absolute authority is justified. The reasoning he gives is amenable or suggests more democratic forms of government, or it pushes in that direction. It's not as though the king becomes king by divine fiat and the people have nothing to do with it, right? And God authorizes the king. That's not Hobbes's idea at all. Quite to the contrary, authority originally rests with the people, And the people give their authority to the king. They cede their authority to the king. And so what we really get in Hobbes, what we find in Hobbes is this idea of the consent of the governed being essential to legitimate political authority. And we're going to see Locke take this idea up, right? He's very influenced by Hobbes as far as this goes, on this idea of the consent of the governed being the source of legitimate political authority. Locke is going to take this idea up, but take it in a more democratic direction.